He planned the lie carefully. The car service was booked. The suitcase was packed. He even had his assistant send a calendar hold. San Francisco, Business Development Summit, 4 days. All of it was real. All of it was true, except for one small detail. Nathaniel Royce had no intention of boarding that plane. He told himself it was necessary. That was the word he kept using in his head as his driver pulled away from the iron gates of the Royce estate that Tuesday morning. Necessary. He had a company to protect, a staff of 47 to answer to, and an inheritance dispute that had been bleeding quietly for the better part of 2 years. If there were people in his own household helping his cousin Damon gather information, financial records, personal correspondence, anything that could be used in court, he needed to know. His lawyer had suggested surveillance. Nathaniel had dismissed it as paranoia, but the doubt had grown roots, and so had the silence. He checked into a modest hotel 2 miles from his own home, paid in cash, used a name his assistant knew but his household didn't. By Wednesday evening, he was parked down the block from the service entrance to the Royce estate in a rented sedan that smelled like pine air freshener and old coffee, watching. He wasn't entirely sure what he expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe the paranoia his lawyer had been feeding him would come to nothing, and he could fly out Thursday morning, board the real conference, and come home feeling like a fool who'd wasted 2 nights in a sedan. That would have been fine. He almost wanted that. What he found instead rearranged everything he thought he knew about the people living under his roof. The first night, nothing happened. The lights in the main house went dark by 10. The kitchen staff left through the back gate by 10:30. He watched the windows the way you watch a fire that hasn't caught yet. Patient, tense, not entirely sure what you're waiting for. The second night, he almost didn't go back. He sat in his hotel room at 7 p.m. with a room service sandwich going cold beside him, his phone buzzing with emails he couldn't focus on, and thought seriously about ending this, about the absurdity of a man worth $94 million crouched in a rental car outside his own home because he'd started doubting the people he paid to work for him. But he went back. And that was the night everything changed. At 9:47 p.m., the light came on in the East Wing. Not the main house, the East Wing, the part of the estate that hadn't been properly lived in since his mother, Margaret Royce, had been moved to the ground floor suite 8 months ago, after her first fall. The East Wing was where the good furniture was draped in dust covers, where the portrait of his grandfather hung in the long gallery, where no one had any reason to be at 9:47 on a Wednesday night. Nathaniel sat up straighter. Through the trees, he could see the warm amber of a single lamp moving. Not the overhead lights, a lamp being carried from room to room. He got out of the car. He moved through the side gate using his own code, which no one had thought to change, and came in through the garden path that ran along the east wall. The hedgerows were thick enough to give him cover. The September air was cold and sharp in a way that made everything feel more real than it should have. His own shoes on his own gravel, his own breath. Through the tall window of the East Wing parlor, he could see her. Adela Voss, his mother's personal maid, had been in his household for 14 months. He'd hired her through an agency after the second nurse quit, not because nursing was too hard, but because Margaret Royce was. She was 81, sharp as a tack, mean as a hornet when she wanted to be, and deeply, stubbornly resistant to any help that felt like pity. She'd fired the first 2 nurses in a week. The agency had sent Adela as something of a last resort. Adela had lasted, more than lasted. She'd somehow become the only person Margaret Royce didn't actively try to drive out of the room. Nathaniel had noted that and been grateful for it without ever looking too closely at why. Now he stood in the cold dark outside his own parlor window and watched Adela moving through that room with a kind of focused quiet that made no sense at all for the hour. She had set up a portable lamp on the old game table near the window. Beside it was a stack of books, a basin of water, and a small wooden box Nathaniel didn't recognize. His mother was in the chair, not in bed, not sedated or half asleep with the television murmuring. She was sitting up straight in the old wingback chair, her thin hands resting on her knees, her white hair pinned back the way she used to wear it when Nathaniel was a child. She was looking at Adela with an expression he hadn't seen on his mother's face in years. She was engaged, fully, completely present. Adela pulled one of the books from the stack, opened it to a page marked with a scrap of ribbon, and held it up. She said something Nathaniel couldn't hear through the glass. His mother tilted her head and answered. Then, and this was the part that stopped the air in Nathaniel's lungs, his mother laughed. Oh, not the polite, papery sound she made when he said something she felt obligated to respond to. A real laugh, the kind that moved her shoulders and made her press one hand briefly to her chest like it had surprised her. The kind Nathaniel hadn't heard in over 3 years. Oh, and he stood at that window and didn't move for a long time. He watched Adela place the open book in his mother's hands, positioning it at the angle that would be easiest for Margaret's failing eyes to track. He watched his mother read aloud, slowly, haltingly, the words coming back to her the way things come back when you give them enough patience and space. He watched Adela listen without correcting her, without rushing her, without checking a phone or glancing at the clock on the wall. Then Adela opened the small wooden box, and Nathaniel saw that it held paints, watercolors, small and bright in their rows. His mother had painted once, a long time ago, before his father died and the estate got complicated, and Margaret Royce decided grief was easier to manage from behind a wall of iron propriety. Adela set a piece of paper on the game table and put a brush in his mother's hand. Nathaniel watched his mother look at the brush the way you look at something you loved that you'd convinced yourself you'd forgotten. Her fingers closed around it slowly, and she painted. He stepped back from the window. The cold felt different now, not sharp, just present. He turned and walked back through the garden path without making a sound. He didn't go back to the hotel that night. He sat in the rental car for over an hour in the dark, thinking about all the things he didn't know, and then drove to a parking lot near the water and sat there until 1 in the morning with his jacket around his shoulders and his hands wrapped around a cold coffee. He thought about Adela Voss, who he paid to clean his mother's suite and assist her with meals and ensure she didn't fall again. He thought about the contract he'd signed with the agency, which said nothing about reading aloud or watercolor paints or staying past 9 p.m. He thought about the wooden box of supplies she'd clearly brought herself, clearly paid for herself, clearly been doing this, whatever this was, on her own initiative and her own time. And he thought about the fact that he hadn't known, not any of it. He lived 30 meters from his mother's suite, and he hadn't known she was laughing at night. He drove back to the hotel and lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a clean word for. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The thing about Nathaniel Royce was that he had built his entire adult life around the principle of controlled information. He ran his business that way. He ran his household that way. He ran himself that way. Nothing moved without his knowing. Nothing changed without his sign-off. His lawyer called it diligence. His ex-wife had called it other things. He had 31 employees across his household and property operations, and he knew every one of their files. He knew start dates and performance reviews, and whether they had emergency contact details on file. What he had never done, what he was beginning to understand he had systematically avoided doing, was look past the paper. He returned to the estate on Thursday morning under the pretense of a delayed flight. He told his housekeeper, Mrs. Featherstone, that the conference had been pushed by a day. He unpacked his suitcase and resumed his life with a surface level that appeared entirely unchanged. But something was different. He was watching now, and he was watching the right things. Oh, noticed that Adela arrived before her contracted hours every morning. Not by a few minutes, but by 45. He noticed she brought food with her, not her lunch, but things she'd clearly cooked herself. Small jars of broth, wrapped bundles that smelled like herbs and good stock. He noticed that she spoke to his mother in a particular way. Not loudly, the way people sometimes spoke to the elderly as if age had taken their hearing along with everything else. But quietly and directly, one person to another. He noticed his mother's suite had small changes he hadn't authorized. A piece of paper taped to the wall near the chair, not a clinical chart, a watercolor painting, clearly fresh, clearly done by the hand that had painted in the parlor. A vase with herbs near the window, a radio playing at low volume, something classical, the kind of music that had played in the house when Nathaniel was very young, before his father died and the record player was put away. He noticed that when Adela left at the end of her contracted hours, his mother sometimes watched the door for a few minutes afterward with an expression that was not quite sadness and not quite longing, but something in between. The way you look when something good has just ended and you are already calculating the hours until it returns. On Friday, Nathaniel told Mrs. Featherstone he would take his lunch in his office. Then he went to the East Wing Gallery instead, stood in front of his grandfather's portrait, and waited. At 12:15, Adela came through the corridor with a tray, heading for his mother's suite. She saw him and stopped. Her face didn't do anything dramatic. No guilt, no surprise, no performance. She just stopped and held the tray steady and looked at him. She was in her early 30s, medium height, dark hair pulled back the same way every day. She had the kind of face that was easy to overlook in a crowd, but very hard to look away from once you'd actually focused on it, not because of beauty in the conventional sense, but because of an quality that Nathaniel found himself struggling to name. It was something like self-possession, the quality of a person who knew exactly who they were and had stopped needing anyone else to confirm it.
"Mr. Royce," she said, "I thought you were in San Francisco."
"I came back early."
He nodded at the tray.
"What is that?"
Adela looked down at it without embarrassment. "Chicken broth with turmeric and ginger. Mrs. Royce had a poor night. Her knee was bothering her. She tends to eat better when it's warm and easy on her stomach." "I didn't hear she'd had a poor night." "No, she wouldn't have wanted to worry you." Nathaniel studied her. "And the painting?" A pause, brief but there. "Which painting?" "The one on the wall in her suite. The one she didn't have there 2 weeks ago." Adela was quiet for a moment, choosing her words the way someone does when they are not trying to hide something, but are trying to tell it correctly. "Your mother used to paint. She mentioned it early on. Not as something she missed, but casually. She said it had been a long time. I found some basic supplies. Nothing expensive. She's been doing a little most evenings." She met his eyes. "I should have asked permission. I understand that." Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. "Did she ask you to keep it from me?" "No." Adela shook her head once. "She didn't ask me to do any of this, Mr. Royce. She didn't have to." He didn't know what to say to that. Men like Nathaniel Royce almost always knew what to say. He'd built a career on it, but there was something about the plain simplicity of those 5 words that bypassed every prepared response he had and left him standing in the gallery with nothing. He stepped aside. "Take her the broth." Adela nodded and continued down the corridor. Nathaniel turned back to his grandfather's portrait and stood there for a moment longer than he needed to, listening to her footsteps on the stone floor, and then to the sound of his mother's door opening, and to the faint change in the air when he heard his mother's voice say something that made Adela laugh. Quietly, genuinely, the sound tucked close to the door before it closed. He walked back to his office. He sat at his desk. He did not open his emails for 23 minutes. What he did instead was pull Adela Voss's file from the cabinet where he kept all personnel records, and he read it, really read it. Not the way he'd read it 14 months ago when he was checking agency verifications and reference letters, but the way you read something when you already know it matters and you're trying to understand why. The file was thin. Most of the files in his cabinet were thick with performance notes and amendment letters and the bureaucratic residue of complicated employment situations. Adela's was thin, agency certified, references from 2 previous private households. Both glowing, both brief, the kind of glowing brief references that people write when someone is so genuinely good at their work that you run out of ways to adequately say so. No complaints, no incidents, contracted hours of 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. 5 days a week. At the bottom of the file, in the section labeled Additional Information, the agency had written one line: "Ms. Voss has requested that her personal medical history not be shared with household employers. This has been accommodated per agency confidentiality protocol." Nathaniel stared at that line for a long time. He was not a man who tolerated gaps in information. He had a standing arrangement with the agency that required full background disclosure on any placement. He had signed off on that arrangement himself. The fact that someone had accommodated a confidentiality request without bringing it to him told him that whoever had processed Adela's placement had made a judgment call that the information was not operationally relevant. He had always trusted the agency's judgment before. Now, sitting with a file that suddenly felt incomplete,
He wasn't sure whether he was grateful or concerned. He closed the file, placed it back in the cabinet, and tried, without much success, to return to the rest of his afternoon. The person who first told him what he didn't know was not Adela, it was his mother. On Saturday morning, Nathaniel did something he did not do often enough. He went to visit Margaret Royce not because there was a problem, not because Mrs. Featherstone had flagged a concern, but simply because he wanted to. He knocked on the door of the ground-floor suite with a cup of tea from the kitchen and found his mother sitting up in the wingback chair near the window, the morning light across her hands, a small watercolor half-finished on the table beside her. She looked at him when he came in, and her expression was sharp and assessing in the way it had always been, the look that had driven 3 nurses out in their first week. But she didn't say anything acerbic. She said, "You're back early. Flight issues." He set the tea within her reach and pulled up a chair. The watercolor caught the light. Blues and pale greens, abstract shapes that might have been water or might have been hills. "You've been painting," he said. His mother looked at the paper. "A little." "It's good." She didn't thank him for the compliment because Margaret Royce never thanked anyone for a compliment if she could help it. She just looked at it in the considering way of someone who hadn't yet decided whether it was good or not. Then she said, "Adela brought the supplies. Don't be difficult about it." Nathaniel kept his face still. "I wasn't going to be. You have a face that looks like you're about to ask a question that begins with, 'Did I authorize this?' Do I? You've had it since you were 9. She picked up her tea. She didn't do it to ingratiate herself. She did it because she paid attention. There's a difference. Nathaniel was quiet. She noticed the Whitmore landscape in the hall. His mother continued, "The small one your grandmother painted. She asked me about it. I told her I used to paint." A pause. "I didn't expect her to do anything about it. Most people ask questions and then forget the answers. But she didn't. She arrived one morning with a little box she'd bought at the art supply shop on Merchant Street. She said she didn't know what I preferred, so she'd gotten a small set of everything and I could use what I liked and she'd return the rest." Margaret Royce's voice was matter-of-fact, but something in it was careful, protected. The way you speak about something that matters so much you don't want to accidentally break it with too much feeling. She didn't make a production of it. She didn't tell me it would be good for my hand mobility or read me literature on therapeutic activities. She just put the box on the table and asked if I wanted to try. Nathaniel looked at his mother's hands around the teacup, the knuckled, bent fingers that had been stiffening for 2 years now, that she never spoke about, that she had refused every occupational therapy consult he'd arranged because she said it was humiliating to have a stranger move your fingers for you. She was holding the cup with both hands, steadily. "Has she been staying late?" he asked. His mother gave him a sharp look. "Why do you want to know that?" "Because her contract ends at 4. People with good character don't stop being good at 4 o'clock, Nathaniel." She set the cup down with the precise care of someone who had learned that imprecision cost them. "She stays a little sometimes. Not always. Not when she has somewhere to be." A pause. "She has a child." Nathaniel stilled. "What?" His mother looked at him with the particular patience she reserved for moments when she was explaining something to him that should have been obvious. "A daughter. She's young, 6 or 7, I think. Adela doesn't talk about her often, but you can tell." She looked toward the window. "You can always tell when someone is holding someone else in the back of their mind. They get a certain careful look when the afternoon runs late." Nathaniel said nothing. He was thinking about the confidentiality line in the file. He was thinking about a wooden box of watercolor paints purchased with a maid's salary and brought to work in a bag along with small jars of homemade broth. He was thinking about what it meant to do those things quietly, without making a production of it, without expecting recognition. "She's good for you," he said finally, not quite meaning it to come out as a complete thought. His mother considered this. "Yes," she said, and the simplicity of it was somehow more than any elaboration would have been. "She treats me like a person, not like a liability." She looked at him directly, her old eyes still very clear. "You hired her to manage me, Nathaniel. She decided to know me instead. I prefer that arrangement." He left the suite 20 minutes later with an empty teacup and a head full of things he was going to need to organize into some kind of sense. In the kitchen, Mrs. Featherstone was preparing the weekend menu. Nathaniel paused in the doorway and said, as casually as he could manage,
Does Adela come in on weekends often? Mrs. Featherstone looked up, surprised at the question. Oh, she doesn't have weekend hours, sir, but she does pop in on Saturday mornings. Off the clock. Just checks in on your mother, brings something from home usually. A small pause, like she was deciding whether to add more. I've offered to log the hours for her, but she says it isn't necessary. She says she's just nearby. Nearby, Nathaniel repeated.
Her flat is on Pelham Road, sir. About 12 minutes walk. Mrs. Featherstone returned to her menu with the practiced neutrality of a good housekeeper who knew when not to editorialize. She says it's on her way to the market anyway. Nathaniel walked to his study and sat at his desk and did not pretend to look at emails this time. Pelham Road was a 12-minute walk, not a 12-minute drive, a 12-minute walk, which meant Adela Voss lived in the part of town where the buildings were narrow and the walls shared, where young families and working people, and the kind of person who calculated each week with the precision of someone for whom the margin was very thin. Not a bad neighborhood, an honest one, the kind of honest that was quiet because it couldn't afford to be anything else. Where she was a single mother on a private maid's salary, living 12 minutes walk from his estate, spending her own money on watercolor paints and organic broth for a woman who had not asked her to and would not ask her to, coming in on her off days because she was nearby and concerned, and declining to log the hours because she didn't think it was necessary. Nathaniel Royce, who had built a company on the principle of controlled information, sat in his study and realized that the most important things happening in his own house had been completely invisible to him, not because anyone had hidden them, because he hadn't been looking. He stayed in his study for the rest of the afternoon. By evening, he had made several decisions. Some of them were about the estate, most of them were about himself, but one of them was about Adela Voss, and what he was going to do about the fact that a person he had hired and paid and never truly seen was, without any fanfare or expectation of reward, changing his mother's life and revealing the contours of his own failures in the sharpest possible relief. He was going to do something about that. He wasn't yet entirely sure what, but he was going to do something. The following Monday morning, Nathaniel was in the East Wing gallery when Adela arrived for her shift. Not waiting for her, not positioned, he was genuinely looking at the Whitmore landscape, his grandmother's small painting of the headlands in late summer, the one he'd walked past 1,000 times without stopping. He heard her footsteps on the stone and turned. She stopped, looked at the painting, then at him. "Good morning, Mr. Royce." "Good morning." He looked back at the painting. "Did you know my grandmother painted this?" A pause. "Your mother mentioned it. She was self-taught, apparently." "I didn't know that until recently." He turned to face her fully. "I owe you an apology." Whatever Adela had been expecting him to say, it was clearly not that. The self-possession didn't waver, nothing so dramatic, but something in her went still in the way things go still when they are startled. "For what?" she asked carefully. "For not knowing what was happening in my own home." He kept his voice direct. Not warm exactly, but honest in the way that was harder for him than warmth. "You've been doing things for my mother that weren't in your contract, things that have been considerably better for her than anything I arranged." He paused. "I should have known. I didn't." Adela looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The things I do for your mother aren't obligations, Mr. Royce. They're just things I do." "I know. That's part of the apology." She held his gaze, reading something in it, measuring. "You don't need to apologize for not knowing what I didn't tell you." "Maybe not, but I should have been looking." He said it plainly, without drama. "I plan to look more carefully going forward." Something crossed Adela's face then. Not quite weariness, but something adjacent to it. The careful look his mother had described. The look of someone holding someone else in the back of their mind, calculating the weight of a moment. "Is there something you'd like to change about my duties?" she asked. "No," he said it immediately, clearly. "I'd like to formalize some of what you've already been doing, with your agreement, and I'd like to discuss your hours and your compensation." He paused, then added, "And I'd like you to feel that this house is a safe place to work. I'm not entirely certain it has been for you." She was very still. "What do you mean by that?" He thought about his cousin Damon, who had visited the estate 3 times in the past 6 months, who had been charming to the staff in a way that left a residue, who had, Nathaniel now suspected, been asking questions of people who were too polite or too precarious to decline answering. He thought about the thin file in the cabinet and the confidentiality line, and the small woman standing in front of him, who had a 6-year-old daughter and lived 12 minutes away and had never asked him for a single thing. I mean, he said, that there are people in this family's orbit who are not good-natured, and I should have been clearer, earlier, about where my protection extends. Adela looked at him for a long time. He had the feeling she was a person who was very good at deciding how much to trust and how quickly, and that she had made a number of those decisions about him very fast, and was now revising them. "We can talk about the duties," she said finally, "and the hours." He nodded. "After your shift, if that suits." "It suits." She looked at the Whitmore painting one more time, briefly, then back at him. "Your grandmother had good instincts for the light," she said. "She always caught it at the right angle." Then she moved down the corridor toward his mother's suite, and Nathaniel turned back to the painting and stood there for a moment in the quiet of the east wing. Outside the tall window, the autumn morning was clear and white-edged. In the kitchen, something smelled like the broth she'd brought again. Down the corridor, he could already hear his mother's voice. Not the barbed, defensive voice she used with him, but the other one, the real one, the one that laughed. He stayed in the gallery a little longer. He had spent the better part of 2 weeks looking for deception in his own house. He had found something entirely different. Something that was either going to make the next part of his story considerably harder or considerably better. He hadn't yet decided which, but he knew, with the clarity that comes only when you've stopped looking at what you expected and started seeing what was actually there, that he was not going to look away from it again. What he didn't know yet was how much Adela Voss had been carrying. What he didn't know was the specific shape of the danger already circling her. And what he couldn't have known, not yet, not standing there in his own gallery with his grandmother's painting and the smell of good broth in the air, was that the conversation they were going to have after her shift that evening would be interrupted by his cousin Damon arriving unannounced at the front gate with his lawyer, and a story about Adela Voss that was designed very carefully to destroy her. But before any of that, before Damon's car pulled through the gates and the afternoon tipped into something darker, there was the conversation after lunch that Nathaniel replayed many times in the months that followed. The one he nearly missed. The one that turned out to be the thread, the small, pulled thread that, once you found it, unraveled the whole cloth of things he hadn't been seeing. It happened in the kitchen, and he wasn't supposed to hear it. He'd been in the study reviewing contracts when he remembered he'd left his reading glasses on the kitchen counter that morning. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that sends a person through a doorway at exactly the wrong moment or exactly the right one, depending on how the story ends. He came through the corridor quietly, not stealthily, just absorbed in his thoughts, and heard 2 voices through the partly open kitchen door before he reached it. Mrs. Featherstone, his housekeeper, practical, composed, a woman who had worked for 3 generations of his family, and who said perhaps one opinionated thing per week, carefully chosen, and Adela. He couldn't hear everything. He didn't try to hear everything, but the sentences he caught stopped him in the corridor with his hand 4 inches from the door. "Mrs. Meager," Featherstone was saying in a low voice with a particular quality of concern in it, the concern of someone who has noticed something and has been deciding for a while whether to speak. "It was the 2nd time this month. I'm not saying it's anything. I'm saying I noticed." And Adela's voice, very quiet, very controlled. "I know. He was asking the garden staff about your hours, specifically about when you leave through the rear gate." A pause. The kind of pause that lasts exactly as long as it takes a person to decide not to say what they are thinking. "I know," Adela said again. Different tone this time. Not the calm acknowledgement, something heavier, something that sounded like someone who had been carrying a worry for long enough that the muscle had given out. "Mrs. Featherstone, you should tell Mr. Royce." "Adela? And say what? His cousin is asking questions about my schedule? People ask questions. It doesn't mean anything." A beat, then, softer, more honest. "It might not mean anything." "Adela." Mrs. Featherstone's voice was gentle but definitive. "It means something." Another silence. Nathaniel stood in the corridor with his glasses forgotten, and his hand still not touching the door. "I can handle it," Adela said. "You're handling everything," Mrs. Featherstone replied. "That doesn't mean you should have to." Then the sound of a chair moving, of dishes being set down, of the ordinary resumption of things. Nathaniel stepped back and walked to his study without his glasses. He sat at his desk and looked at the contracts he'd been reviewing and thought about his cousin Damon, who had been charming to the staff, who had visited 3 times in 6 months, who had asked the garden staff about Adela's hours. Damon Royce was the son of his father's younger brother. He was 40 years old, well-dressed in the way of men who put great effort into appearing comfortable, and he was contesting the terms of their grandfather's estate trust through a lawyer who specialized in finding procedural irregularities in documents drafted before certain disclosure laws were updated. Nathaniel's own legal team had described the suit as frivolous. His accountant had described it as expensive. Neither of them had said it was harmless, because it wasn't. For nearly 2 years, Damon had been looking for leverage, the kind of leverage that wasn't about the law and wasn't about the money, the personal kind. The kind you find by standing in corridors and listening, by asking garden staff about the schedules of household employees, by doing the slow, quiet work of assembling a story that, with the right framing, could look like anything you needed it to look like. What Nathaniel hadn't understood until now was that Damon might have already found something, or been looking for it in the shape of a woman who lived 12 minutes away and had a young daughter and a confidentiality line in her agency file that no one had ever explained. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer, got the voicemail, left a message that was deliberately understated. He didn't want to escalate until he understood what he was dealing with. Then he sat with the phone in his hand and thought about what Adela had said. "I can handle it." People said that when they'd been handling things alone for so long that they'd stopped being able to imagine another arrangement. He knew that quality. He recognized it in himself. He had spent 2 years handling the Damon situation alone, managing it, containing it, treating it like a structural problem to be solved rather than a personal threat to be named. He had done that because naming it meant acknowledging that someone in his own family wanted to take something from him badly enough to build a false case around it. That was not a comfortable thing to hold. He imagined what it felt like to hold something like that when you were a single mother on a maid's salary with a young daughter and no family solicitor on retainer. He imagined what it felt like to be asked about your hours by the employer's cousin and to know, in the way women who've navigated powerful men's households know things, exactly what that asking meant. And he felt, sitting at his desk in the autumn quiet of his study, something very close to shame. The afternoon light was beginning to angle across the floor when he heard the sound of a car on the gravel outside. Not his usual deliveries, not the estate maintenance van, which had a particular rumble. This was a car he didn't recognize, or rather, a car he recognized immediately, because Damon had driven it to each of his 3 previous visits. A black saloon, very clean. The kind of clean that means hired, not owned. 2 doors, 2 figures coming up the front steps. Nathaniel was already standing when Mrs. Featherstone knocked on his study door. "Mr. Royce." Her voice was careful in a way that was different from her usual careful. "Your cousin is at the door. He has a solicitor with him." Nathaniel looked at her. She looked back at him with her face composed and her eyes saying something her professional discretion wouldn't let her voice. "Is Adela still in the house?" he asked. A fractional pause. "She's with your mother, sir. They're finishing the afternoon session." Nathaniel nodded once. "Show him to the front sitting room. Tell him I'll be 5 minutes." He waited for her to leave. Then he moved, not rushing, not panicked, but with the specific economy of motion that came from understanding that the next several hours were going to require him to be completely clear. He went to his mother's suite first. He knocked once and opened the door. His mother was in the wingback chair, a book in her hands. Adela had been reading to her, and both of them looked up when he came in. He registered, in a quick sweep, that the room felt warm and smelled like the herbs on the windowsill, and that his mother's shoulders were not pulled up around her ears the way they always were when she was tired or in pain. She looked rested. She looked, in a way that he found difficult to articulate, like herself. Adela looked at him with her clear, measuring gaze, and he saw her read something in his face immediately. "My cousin is here," he said. He kept his voice quiet and level. "With a solicitor." He looked at Adela directly. "I'd like you to stay in this wing for the time being. Not because you're in trouble, you're not, but because I need to understand what he wants before you're anywhere near it." Adela put down the book slowly. "What does he want?" "I don't know yet." He paused. "But I intend to find out." His mother was watching him with sharp eyes.
She hadn't become the person who drove 3 nurses out in a week by being slow to understand when something mattered. "Don't let him in this wing," she said. Her voice was clipped, precise. The voice she used when she was being a Royce in the oldest and most serious sense. "I won't," Nathaniel said. He looked at Adela one more time. She was very still. Not frightened, or if she was, it was the kind of fear that had been lived with long enough to become something more like resolve. "I'll come back," he said, "when I know what we're dealing with." And he closed the door and walked down the corridor toward the front sitting room, and toward whatever version of the story Damon Royce had spent 2 years constructing. The sitting room was cold and overbright, the afternoon sun cutting through the west windows at an angle that made everything look slightly overexposed. Damon was standing near the fireplace, which wasn't lit, in a charcoal suit that Nathaniel recognized as new. Beside him sat a man Nathaniel didn't know, mid-40s, briefcase on his knee, the sort of professional neutrality that concealed a great deal of opinion. "Nathaniel." Damon smiled with all the warmth of a man who had rehearsed warmth. "I'm sorry to turn up like this. We tried to reach your PA. She would have told you I was in San Francisco." "Yes, well, we're glad you're home." Damon gestured to the man beside him. "This is Mr. Crane. He's been helping me with a matter I think you'll want to hear about." "I'm sure you think so," Nathaniel said. He remained standing. He did not offer tea. Damon's smile thinned only slightly. He had always been good at this, the performance of reasonable concern. "It's about one of your household staff, your mother's maid." He paused, letting that land. "A woman named Adela Voss." Nathaniel said nothing. He waited. Damon glanced at Crane, then back. "We've become aware of some information about her background, information that may be relevant to your legal situation with the estate. And more importantly," he modulated his voice to something softer, more sorrowful, more practiced, "to your mother's safety." Nathaniel looked at his cousin, at the charcoal suit, at the rehearsed sorrow, at the briefcase on Mr. Crane's knee with its clean brass clasps. "What information?" he said. Damon sat down, slowly, with the confidence of a man who believed he already had what he'd come for. "We'll need a few minutes," he said. "And you'll want to sit down." Outside, through the west windows, the afternoon had turned the color of cold embers. Down the corridor, in the East Wing suite with the watercolor on the wall and the herbs on the windowsill and the book left open on the table, Adela Voss sat beside Margaret Royce and waited. And whatever was in that briefcase, whatever story Damon Royce had been building for months in quiet corridors and careful questions, was about to become the most important thing Nathaniel had heard in years. Whether it was true was another matter entirely. Damon Royce had a particular gift for delivering bad news in a way that made him appear to be the victim of it. He leaned forward in the sitting room chair, hands loosely clasped, expression arranged into something between reluctance and deep personal regret. When they have rehearsed concern so thoroughly it has become indistinguishable from the real thing. "We became aware of this through the estate proceedings," he began. "My legal team was reviewing third-party financial disclosures, standard procedure, and a name came up that we recognized." Crane opened the briefcase and extracted a thick folder. "Adela Voss," Damon said, savoring the name slightly, like a card player naming a hand. "She came to you through the Meridian agency. Did they share her full history?" He nodded to Crane, who set down the first document. "A civil suit, 3 years ago. A family named Calloway. She was employed as a carer for the elderly Mrs. Calloway, and there were allegations, financial irregularities, small withdrawals from the account, the kind designed to go unnoticed." He paused, settled out of court, no criminal charges. The agency was notified, which is why the confidentiality clause exists in her file. Another paper landed on the table. Your mother's personal account. 3 withdrawals in the past 4 months, consistent with the pattern in the Calloway case. Damon's voice softened. "I didn't want this to be true, Nathaniel. I want you to know that." Nathaniel looked at the bank summary. £40 here, 60 there. The kind of amounts that meant nothing on their own, and could be made to mean anything with the right frame. He looked at his cousin's practiced sorrow, at Crane watching him, waiting to see which way the river would run. "Leave those documents," Nathaniel said. "I'll have my solicitor review them tonight, and then I'll speak with Adela Voss directly." Damon stood, smoothly recalibrating. "Of course, we're not here to make accusations." He paused at the front door. If you need to let her go quietly, no fuss. That's the cleanest way, better for everyone. Nathaniel looked at his cousin for a long moment. "Good night, Damon," he said, and closed the door. He stood alone in the hall, then walked back and picked up the documents and studied them carefully in the cold afternoon light. He knew the difference between a document that was telling the truth and one arranged to look like it was. The reference numbers, the formatting, the language, something felt assembled rather than real. He called his solicitor, left a message that was not understated. "Verify a civil proceeding. Harwick, 3 years ago. Callaway versus Voss. If it doesn't exist, I need to know that faster." Then he walked to the East Wing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The suite was warm and quiet. His mother was asleep in the wingback chair, the watercolor on the wall catching the lamplight. Adela sat at the game table with her hands folded, and she turned when he came in with the quiet composure of someone who had spent 2 hours anticipating exactly this. We told her what Damon had said. She listened without flinching. "Tell me about the Callaway family," he said. Something in her face shifted, not guilt, but exhaustion. The kind that comes when a thing you've been carrying finally stops pretending to be light.
Mrs. Callaway was 84. I cared for her for 11 months. She died peacefully in her chair. A pause. 3 weeks later, her son arrived and found withdrawals he didn't recognize. They were hers, small amounts, in cash, for a food bank, for a neighbor's prescription. She was a private woman who didn't want her son involved in her generosity. Adela's voice was steady, each word set down carefully. She hadn't written any of it down. When her son arrived looking for something to be angry about, I was the only explanation that fit. There was no formal suit. Just letters, correspondence, a resolution. No court record exists. She met his eyes. If your solicitor searches for it, he won't find it. "My mother's account," Nathaniel said. "Her prescription. A dispensing issue at the pharmacy on Greystone Road. She asked me to pay in cash until it was resolved and reimbursed me from her account." Adela's chin lifted slightly. "I have every receipt. I keep receipts for everything. I learned that after the Callaway situation." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "I don't need them tonight." Something in her composure fractured, very briefly at the edges. A single slow breath, the kind that comes when you've been braced for a blow and it hasn't landed. "He has more than the document," she said then. He stilled. "What do you mean?" 3 months ago, a man came to Petra's school, said he was doing an employment background check. Asked the administrator about her attendance records, her medical appointments. She paused. "The administrator told me. The man knew details he shouldn't have known for a routine check." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Petra, my daughter, she's 7. She has a congenital heart condition. Managed, monitored, not in immediate danger. But it costs." Adela said it with the clinical precision of someone who had rehearsed the words into something less frightening. "That's what he's actually building. Not a theft case, a profile, a carer with a chronically ill dependent, liability, missed days, costs. It would make me unemployable, not just here, anywhere reputable." A breath. "So yes, I stayed knowing all of this because your mother is 81 years old and she started painting again, and Petra's specialist appointment is the last week of November and I need the 6 weeks of wages between now and then." The room held the weight of that. Nathaniel looked at Adela Voss and thought about the moment 3 nights ago when he had stood outside a window in the cold and seen his mother laughing for the first time in 3 years. He had come home expecting to find a traitor. He had found something entirely opposite. He set his personal card on the table. "My direct number, not the house line. Mine. You've been handling something alone that you shouldn't have had to handle alone. That stops tonight." From the wingback chair, his mother stirred and opened her eyes. Sharp, fully present, she looked at them both and understood the room in a single sweep. "They will not remove you," she said to Adela. Not a question, not a reassurance, a declaration. Something in Adela's face cracked open at the edges. The specific, quiet relief of a person who has been fighting alone for a very long time and has just, for the first time, been told they don't have to. She pressed her lips together once, nodded. His mother reached out and took Adela's hand, the old bent fingers around the younger ones, both of them very still in the lamplight. "Go," she said to Nathaniel without looking up. "Do what needs doing." He went. And before midnight, Hennessy's message arrived. Document firm out of Bristol. 3 prior forgeries confirmed. Suggest reviewing Damon R. personal accounts for payments to Meridian agency staff. Will explain tomorrow. Nathaniel read the last line twice. Payments to Meridian agency staff. He sat in the dark and understood that he had not found a traitor in his house. He had found a trap, set for someone who had no idea she was the target. She wasn't alone anymore. That was the thing Damon had never accounted for. Hennessy called at 8:47 the next morning. Nathaniel was already at his desk, going through trust documents his grandfather's solicitor had couriered overnight, older ones, from the original drafting in 1987. He had a reason for looking at them. He wasn't yet ready to say the reason out loud. The Bristol forgery firm traces directly to Damon, Hennessy said without preamble. Same methodology as a prior property dispute 6 years ago. The Meridian agency payments are more interesting. Indirect. Run through a Cardiff consulting entity that doesn't actually exist. The payments began 14 months ago. A pause. 2 weeks before Adela Voss was placed with your household. The room went very quiet. He arranged the placement, Nathaniel said. Someone paid to ensure she was the specific candidate selected for your household. After the call, Nathaniel sat for a long time without moving. The picture he was building was older and more deliberate than anything he had expected when he'd parked a rental car outside his own estate and watched for signs of a traitor. Damon had positioned Adela inside the house, not to exploit her initially, but to use her, to have someone he could leverage over time. Except Adela had not been the kind of person who could be leveraged, so he had pivoted. If she wouldn't be his instrument, she would be his scapegoat. What Nathaniel still didn't understand was why her specifically. He opened the unredacted trust document, the one the old solicitor had couriered with a handwritten note. I think it is time you saw this properly. His grandfather's estate trust had 3 principal beneficiaries. 2 he knew. The third was a name that had been redacted from every version of the document currently in dispute. Here, in the original, it was written in full. Vera Linden, private secretary to Nathaniel's grandfather for 11 years, removed from the trust in 1991 by a legal instrument filed by Damon's father. The supplementary notes added a single line in cramped, thorough handwriting. The daughter was given the mother's maiden name at the mother's request following the dissolution of the arrangement. The mother's maiden name was Voss. Nathaniel read that line 3 times. He was still sitting with it when his mother appeared in the doorway, dressed, hair pinned, upright in a way she hadn't managed unassisted in 4 months. She looked at the documents on his desk, then at him. You found it, she said. How long have you known? She came in slowly and lowered herself into the chair across from him. Your grandfather told me before he died. He said Damon's father had done something that wasn't right and he hadn't had the strength to fight it. He didn't know about the daughter. A pause. When Adela came, I suspected. Not from her face, from the quality of her attention. Your grandfather had that. It was the thing no one in this family inherited. She looked at him steadily. Except apparently her. Did she know? When she came here? No. She carries things the way someone carries a weight they've been given without explanation. She doesn't know who she is in relation to this family. His mother's voice was quiet and precise. You're going to have to tell her. He found Adela in the East Wing corridor, coming from his mother's suite with an empty tray. She looked up and read something in his face immediately and went still. Come with me, he said. He took her to the gallery, the long room with the tall windows and the portraits, where his grandfather's oil painting hung at the far end in the good light. He watched her walk toward it. He watched her stop. She stood in front of the portrait for a long time. The cold morning light fell across her face and across the painted face of the old man in the frame, and in the quality of their stillness, the particular way each of them held attention, absorbed rather than observed. The resemblance was unmistakable. My mother's name was Vera, she said, not a question. Yes, Nathaniel said. She turned to look at him, and her face was rearranged. The way a face rearranges itself when a thing carried without understanding suddenly has a shape. She worked for him, Adela said, for 11 years. After the arrangement ended, she kept your existence private and gave you her maiden name. He paused. She died in 2009. You would have been 20. I was 20, she said softly. She was sick for 2 years before that. I left university to care for her. A pause. She never told me his name. She said my father had been a good man in a situation that couldn't hold. She didn't sound bitter. She just sounded like she was describing the weather. Nathaniel looked at the portrait of his grandfather, the man who had told his mother it wasn't right and he was sorry, who had not known about the daughter, who had left a trust document and a solicitor with 30 years of patience and a handwritten note that said it was time. Damon's father removed your mother from the trust in 1991, Nathaniel said. If the original terms had held, the trust would have extended to her heirs. You have a claim, not the majority, but enough to make Damon's contest of the trust considerably harder if it became known that the original document was improperly altered. He paused. He arranged your placement here to keep you close and compromised, to ensure that if the trust question ever came to a head, you would be too discredited, too frightened, too alone to assert anything. Adela was very still.
A single mistimed blast, a signal sent before the chokerman had cleared the log, before the rigging slinger had confirmed the choker was properly set, before the men in the timber were out of the path of whatever was about to move, and the drum began turning and the cable began tightening, and whatever was in the way of that process had approximately no time to get out of it. The whistle punk knew this. He was 17 years old on many operations, sometimes younger. He stood at his wire in the noise and the smoke and the falling bark and the particular chaos of a working donkey operation, and he watched the rigging slinger's hands, and he tried not to make a mistake. Some of them made mistakes. The machine didn't distinguish between a correct signal and an incorrect one. The drum turned when the engineer opened the throttle. The cable tightened when the drum turned, the log moved when the cable tightened, and everything in the path of the log moved with it or was moved by it. And the difference between those two outcomes was the difference between a man walking home at the end of the shift and a man being carried. This was the system. This was the beast, and the men who fed it, and the men who worked around it in the timber, and the men who sent the signals, and the man who sat at the throttle and held the whole operation in his hands. Now you need to understand what it actually meant to be one of those men. From the moment the fire was lit before dawn to the moment the last log came in and the pressure was bled down and the crew walked back to camp in the dark.
He knew who I was, she said. He has known for some time. She looked at the portrait one last time, then back at him. What was in her face now was not grief, not anger, something more complicated, something that would take longer than a morning in a gallery to fully name. What happens now? She asked. There's a legal process, he said. It would require you to assert your claim as Vera Linden's heir. It would mean being visible in a way you haven't been, in a way that Damon has been working very hard to prevent. He paused. It would also end his ability to use you. All of it collapses the moment you're no longer the anonymous maid he can shape into whatever narrative he needs. The moment you're yourself. She was quiet, and then she said, My mother used to say that the thing about keeping a secret is that the secret keeps you too. You can't move freely. You can't stand up straight. She looked at the portrait one final time. I think I'd like to stand up straight. The confrontation with Damon happened the following Tuesday in Nathaniel's solicitor's office, a room with a long table, natural light, and no unnecessary furniture. Nathaniel sat with his solicitor and Adela, quiet and composed in the same dark dress she wore to difficult things, Hennessy's financial report in a folder between them. Damon arrived smoothly in the charcoal suit, with Crane and a second solicitor. He saw Adela and recalculated. The look of a man whose chessboard has unexpectedly changed configuration. Nathaniel's solicitor laid it out in order. The Bristol forgery firm, the Cardiff payment trail, the Meridian agency placement fee, and finally, set at the center of the table, the unredacted original trust document. Damon looked at that document for a long time. The procedural instrument filed by your father in 1991 is now the subject of a formal challenge, the solicitor said. The challenge will establish that Vera Linden's removal was conducted improperly and without valid grounds. Her heir is present in this room. Damon looked at Adela, really looked at her, the way he clearly had not permitted himself to before, as if looking directly might confirm what he had been circling all this time. You knew, he said to Nathaniel. How long? Long enough, Nathaniel said. The forgery charge is a separate proceeding. Not in my hands, Nathaniel continued. Hennessy's report goes to the appropriate parties today regardless of what happens in this room. What is in my hands is whether I pursue the full scope of what you've done. The placement arrangement, the payments to the agency, the visits to her daughter's school. He said the last part quietly. Her 7-year-old daughter. You sent someone to her school. The silence that followed had the quality of a man measuring what he has left and finding it considerably less than he thought. What do you want? Damon said. Withdraw the estate contest entirely. A signed agreement of no further contact with Adela Voss or her daughter. A written acknowledgement of the payments to the Bristol firm and the agency. He paused, and you understand that if any of those conditions are not met, every piece of documentation in Hennessy's report goes to the full range of people who would find it interesting. Damon looked at Adela one last time. She looked back with an expression that was not triumphant, not vindictive, simply present. The look of someone who has finally stopped carrying something they were given without their consent. All right, Damon said quietly. Not a broken man, a calculated one, who had run the numbers and found they no longer worked in his favor. The meeting ended. Papers were set in motion. Damon left without looking at the small reproduction of his grandfather's portrait on the corridor wall. In the weeks that followed, the estate proceedings resolved, not quickly, but in the direction of water finding its level. Adela's role in the household was formalized, properly compensated, fully honest about what it had always been. And on a Saturday in October, she brought Petra to the estate. Petra was small for 7, with dark eyes that missed nothing, and a directness Nathaniel recognized immediately. She walked into the East Wing suite ahead of her mother, looked at the watercolor on the wall, looked at Margaret Royce in the wingback chair, and said without preamble, "Did you paint that?" Margaret looked at the child with her sharpest gaze. "I did. It's good. The blue part looks like it's moving. That's what I was trying for." A pause. "Sit down. I'll show you how." Adela stood in the doorway and watched her daughter climb onto a chair beside an 81-year-old woman and accept a brush with the gravity of someone being handed something important. She was learning, in small, careful increments, to think of Margaret as her mother, not yet aloud, not yet in front of others, but privately in the working part of her mind. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. He looked at the room, the lamp, the herbs on the windowsill, the old woman and the small child bent over a shared task with identical expressions of absolute concentration. "My grandfather would have loved her," he said quietly. "Rode in fear would the television," Adela said. "He argued with Parliament. Comes to the same thing." She laughed, quietly, genuinely, the sound he had first heard through a closed door weeks ago, and had been grateful for ever since. Inside, Petra held up her paper, blue everywhere, enthusiastic and boundless. Margaret tilted her head and considered it with the seriousness of someone who took beauty on its own terms. "Bold," she said. Petra grinned, the gap in her front teeth catching the lamplight. "My teacher says I'm a lot." "Your teacher," Margaret said in a tone that disposed of the teacher entirely, "has no imagination." Adela pressed her back to the corridor wall and breathed the old house smell, stone and beeswax and the herbs on the windowsill, and let it all be real for a moment. She thought about her mother, Vera Linden, who had kept a secret not out of shame but out of protection, and who had died not knowing that the residue of her life had eventually found its way back to where it belonged. She thought about a rental car parked outside a service gate, about a man watching a window in the cold and finding, instead of what he expected, something that changed the direction of everything. She had kept every receipt. She had arrived before her contracted hours. She had brought broth in small jars and watercolor paints in a wooden box, and sat in the evenings reading aloud to a woman who needed to be known, not managed. She had done all of it quietly, without asking for recognition, and the truth had found a way to the surface, as it always does, when someone has lived with enough care and enough honesty and enough quiet refusal to become less than they are. From inside the suite, "I think I need more blue," and Margaret, "You always need more blue. The question is where?" And Petra, after a pause, "Everywhere." And Margaret Royce, in the voice that had held 81 years of being exactly and entirely herself. "Correct." Nathaniel stood beside Adela in the amber light, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. They simply listened to the sound of a 7-year-old and an 81-year-old making something together, and understood that what they were hearing was the sound of a life becoming what it was always meant to be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.